All right, welcome everyone. This is lecture 7. We're questioning, well, the theme for today is questioning tradition and Descartes. So according to Descartes, what is the one thing that we can know for sure? I do have a video here which I think ties in pretty nicely, so I would ask you to check it out when you get a chance. All right, so the plan for today, part 1, we're going to talk about the scientific revolution. Part 2, we're going to look at early modern France. We looked at early modern Spain in the previous lecture on Don Quixote. Here we're moving on to France. And in particular, we'll talk a little bit about the French Renaissance. In part 2, we'll zoom in and focus on Descartes, and then also look at his meditations on first philosophy. Okay, so part 1. First, a few key terms. The first one here is Enlightenment. This is a European intellectual movement of the late 17th and 18th centuries, emphasizing reason and individualism rather than tradition. The next one is epistemology. This is the study of knowledge, especially with regards to its methods, validity, and scope. Epistemology is the investigation of what distinguishes justified belief from opinion. So basically, it's looking at really where knowledge comes from. Next one here is rationalism. So that is a belief or theory that opinions and actions should be based on reason and knowledge rather than on religious belief or emotional response. And the last one here is skepticism. And this is the doctrine that true knowledge or knowledge in a particular area is uncertain. The method of suspended judgment, systematic doubt, or criticism characteristic of skeptics. So this is really just this systematic doubt of received knowledge. Okay. So before we get into that, I do want to take a step back and just continue where we left off a couple lectures ago, talking about the scientific revolution, as it does lead into Descartes. So some elements of note within the scientific revolution. First, we have this emphasis on individual agency and experimentation. So here we see that individuals gain knowledge or gain access to knowledge of the natural world through personal observation and experimentation. So not just from received authorities, so figures like Aristotle, which is what we see in the Middle Ages predominantly. Also, the idea here is that individuals are able to challenge received knowledge and accepted beliefs. So individuals are able to think for themselves and really base their knowledge upon observation and their own personal engagement with the world. All right, next one here is new ideas of nature and the universe. So here, again, we see this idea that the universe is in constant motion. And again, this is in contrast to what we see in the Middle Ages, where we have this idea of the universe being static and being set in one place and being, at least in the heavens, unchanging as well. Here we see that the heavens and earth are ruled by the same laws. Nature, because heaven and earth are ruled by the same laws, can be understood through experimentation, mathematics, and also careful observation. And nature in this way leads to an understanding of God. Okay, cool. So that brings us to the historical context, looking at early modern France. So some basic background information here. Some of the dynasties we see during this period. The first one is the Valois. And then we go to the Bourbon. And this is really the main, or really one of the most significant French dynasties, which we'll focus on a little bit. And it does overlap with the Habsburgs, which we talked about in Spain last time. Okay, so what we see happening in France during this period, in general, what we see in the, well, let's take a step back. So in general, what we see in the Middle Ages in France are a number of very strong semi-independent areas. So we have things like the Duchy of Brittany, the Duchy of Burgundy, and so on, that are really, for all intents and purposes, independent of centralized rule. They're independent of the King of France. They might be his vassal, but they're not subject to what? They're not under his direct control. What we see happening during this period is these areas begin to be incorporated into what we now think of as France. It begins to we see a more centralized authority. At the same time, we see the rise of French nationalism for really the first time, this idea of French being this national identity, as opposed to being, from Brittany or Burgundy or, Aquitaine or whatnot. We also get the consolidation of the French language, which sounds nice, but the way that they would do this is by really brutally oppressing and really trying to stamp out a lot of these local languages, which in many cases, like in Occitan, have this long, centuries-old tradition as well. However, what we do see in general is we see a lot of positive changes. So we have what's known as the beautiful 16th century, this period of peace and prosperity in France. And this does really kind of come to an end with these wars of religion that break out. So we see this conflict between Catholics and French Protestants, who are known as Huguenots, really in the second half of the 16th and the early 17th century. And this does play into a lot of these larger wars of religion as well, which we talked about when we talked about Luther. Okay, so the 16th century, in addition to being this beautiful century, was also the period predominantly of the French Renaissance. And this ties into the general European Renaissance, which is flourishing between about 1500 and 1700. So in the general European Renaissance, we see this flourishing of culture and the arts. We also see a focus on individuality and humanism. We can see how this ties into not just the Renaissance, but also the scientific revolution, and which we'll talk about later, the Enlightenment as well. In France, for the French Renaissance, we see it really reaching its apex under Francis I in the early 16th century. And this is going on at the same time as the Protestant Reformation as well. This is a period of great artists in France. So people like Da Vinci and Rubens are working in France during this period. Da Vinci is obviously Italian, but we see them being drawn to the court in France, first in Paris and then later in Versailles. So we also see new developments in architecture, in particular the Baroque, which you see in the Chateau here on the left. And we see new approaches in literature as well. So we see the increased use of satire in both Latin and French. And this again corresponds to what we see happening in Spain and England as well. Okay, so one of the main figures from this period, as we get into the 17th century, is Louis XIV. So he's a member of the Bourbon dynasty. He comes to be known as the Sun King. He actually comes to the throne at the age of 4, and he rules France in this period of success, expansion, and wealth. So during this period, we really see France taking over from Spain as the dominant power in Europe. And Louis XIV himself reigns for about 72 years. And he still has a record for the longest reign, although Elizabeth II in England is coming up on him pretty quickly. All right, so the importance of Louis XIV, we get this reinforcement of absolute rule. So Louis XIV believed strongly in the divine right of kings. So this idea that authority, royal authority, actually comes from God. And so it's not something that was given by people. Instead, it's something that comes directly from God. And as such, he has this inherent right to rule because God is the one who wants him to rule. So this authority, this legitimacy is coming directly from heaven. In general, we also see under Louis XIV, this centralization of political power. We see this, it really speeds up this unification of France and this real focus on unifying the country and having as strong a centralized state as possible. One of the things that Louis does to help make this happen is the construction of Versailles, which you can see here. Versailles is just overwhelming. It's this unbelievable statement of power and wealth. It's a massive, massive palace complex. So it's not just one building, but multiple buildings. It costs the equivalent of about $2 billion today. So can you imagine a $2 billion palace? It's funny, I was about to say a $2 billion building, but I guess with sports stadiums now, they're 2 billion or 5 billion. But anyways, this is intended as a royal residence, and it was a $2 billion price tag. And we see Louis XIV is what he does is he forces the important nobles of the kingdom to reside in the palace where he can keep an eye on them. And so this idea that anyone who might be conspiring against him, anyone that might be causing trouble, is actually there in Versailles. So this is one way of keeping control over the state, keeping control over really any rivals he might have. And so we see him building this palace as a way of centralizing power and also impressing and intimidating allies and possible rivals as well. And I would encourage you to watch this video as well, as it does break down a little bit more about Versailles. So, but the key takeaway here, the point I want you to take with you is just as we move from the 16th century, which is really Spain's century, into the 17th, we really do see the rise of France and France becoming this global power at the same time that it does become the dominant force in Europe. So during this period, we see the expansion of the French colonial empire. We have what's known as the first French colonial empire in the 16th century, up until about 1814. And you can see this is predominantly in what today is Canada, but also Louisiana as well. I mean, this is the period in the 17th century. In the early 18th century, when we see the founding of New Orleans, for instance, where New Orleans becomes this major settlement. and also in the Caribbean as well. We do have French colonies here. And so what we see France doing in this initial period is focusing on North America and the Caribbean. We see this lucrative trade in the West Indies as well. And they do end up losing most of these colonies in North America in the 18th century, particularly to Britain. So you have the 7 Years' War, which ends in 1763, where we see England taking control over what's now Canada. And we actually see Spain taking control over what's now Louisiana. Spain would give that back to France in a subsequent treaty, but then France under Napoleon will actually sell it to the United States in the Louisiana Purchase. So that's when they ultimately lose that territory. Okay, so a few questions for you all. The first one, how was early modern France influenced by the Protestant Reformation and by the Renaissance? The Protestant Reformation, I think one of the big things we see here is we do see this conflict over religion. We see this competition over religion. We see this fighting over religion. And I think this really marks a lot of the development in early modern France. At the same time, turning to the second question for the Renaissance, we do see a lot of new ideas coming in. And I think these two are probably related as well. And with both the Protestant Reformation and the Renaissance, we see this idea of individuality, this idea of human agency, this idea of really centering humans in the cosmos. And we see it shaping French society and shaping a lot of these artistic developments that take place, whether it's the Baroque or whether it's Baroque architecture, or whether you're talking about some of these literary ideas where we start seeing this challenging of perceived authority. Okay, number two. Why did Louis XIV build Versailles, and how did it help him to pursue his larger political goals? I think a big thing here is it's a symbol. He wants to show people that he is the most powerful, that he is the ultimate king. And this is one way of really encouraging allies by this display of economic might, architectural might, as well cultural might. And also at the same time overawing his rivals as well. Like, look what he's able to do. Look at this palace that he's able to build. This is one way of showing that he is the ultimate authority. He is the ultimate power. Okay, so number three, why did France pursue a colonial empire? What did they gain or help to gain? I think a lot of it is, again, going back to prestige. I mean, the fact that Spain had this massive empire. I think France, as a way of showing that they were now this preeminent power, wanted to establish this massive empire themselves, this massive territorial empire. I think also in a more pragmatic reason, or more kind of looking at it economically, we do see not the influx of gold and silver like we see with Spain, but we do get raw materials from the Americas, whether that's lumber, or predominantly in the case of French Canada, we see with furs as well. So this is one way of helping French industry and really bringing economic wealth back to France as well. Okay, so to recap, part one, we talked about early modern France, we talked about the French Renaissance, we talked about Louis XIV, the Sun King, and we talked about the extent of the French colonial empire as well. So part two, let's go ahead and let's focus on Descartes. So Descartes, I have this short video that gives you a little bit of an overview of his life, which I'd encourage you to watch. But just some basic information here. Descartes was a French mathematician, scientist, and philosopher. He was also a member of the minor nobility. He received a classical education in a Jesuit college. He served as a gentleman soldier in a number of wars as a young man. He later moved to the Netherlands in search of more intellectual freedom, which he found, but he felt persecuted for a long time. We actually see Descartes moving from house to house to house because he thought that people were after him, which in some cases they were, but we do see him kind of living this very kind of wandering existence. Okay. He does become this major philosophical figure. He's also a major mathematician, but he is considered to be the father of modern philosophy. And his work is later put into the index of prohibited books by the Catholic Church, so is seen as a threat by the Catholic Church. And he ends up dying in Sweden, ultimately. He's in Sweden, again, searching for more support from those in positions of authority, but he does end up dying in Sweden. Yeah, I mean, the story here, the anecdote here is that supposedly the Queen of Sweden wanted to see him, and so she called for him. It was raining, he didn't want to go, but he had to go, and he goes out, he catches pneumonia from the rain, and he dies. So anyway, some of his main ideas. So for Descartes, one of his big ideas is the deductive method. So we start with these general assumptions, and then we're able to infer specific ones. He also argued that we should begin with no assumptions about reality. So this idea of radical skepticism, just being radically skeptical of everything that we are told, everything that everything that authorities tell us to be true. We also see this idea of spatial relationships. So he talks about spatial relationships and general laws that can be expressed in mathematical formulas. He believed that anything basically could be expressed using mathematics, and that if we're able to find the right formula, the right way of expressing something, any different thing could be expressed mathematically. He's also considered to be the father of analytic geometry. He plotted algebraic equations on a graph linking Greek, Hindu, and Arabic mathematics. He also formulated a modern version of the mind-body problem, this idea of this duality between the mind and the body, whether we exist as the body, whether this is who we are, or whether it's more in the mind. And if you were to remove the mind from the body, where is the sense of I? Does the I reside in the body, or does it reside ultimately in the mind? He also provided logical arguments for the existence of God, which we don't talk about so much in these readings, but they are later in the meditations. So speaking of the meditation, so Basic Info is published in 1641. So about 30 years after the publication of Don Quixote, more or less. I mean, Don Quixote 1605 and 1615. We're actually a little bit before Newton, but we're quite a bit after some of the other figures that we discussed. Okay, so they were composed in Latin. The first edition includes responses from contemporary philosophers as well. This is something I think is really awesome. He comes up with this idea, and before he publishes it, he actually sends it to a number of the major philosophers of the day. He sends it to Hobbes, for instance, who we'll talk about next time, and he wants feedback. And he actually includes the feedback that these philosophers gave, this kind of early peer editing process. He includes the feedback in the actual version that he publishes, which is really, really cool, I think. Anyway, so the content, we see argument is based on methodic doubt and skepticism. We see these ideas of universal doubts, and we get these ontological arguments for God's existence as well. So ontological, really looking at the pure element of being, right? So I mean, so looking at God's existence as really coming from this point of view, this perspective of this focus on being, on existence. Okay, so some of the main themes we see in this reading. We get the systematic doubt and skepticism of one's senses. This idea that existence is proven by thoughts. We get the nice Latin phrase, cogito ergo sum, I think, therefore I am. We get this rationalist understanding of reality, this idea that reason, that knowledge comes from our intellect, comes from what we perceive with our minds rather than from our senses. So this intellect is the basis of knowledge. And one thing that's fascinating here is we do see Descartes going back in this ancient tradition. So historically, going all the way back to ancient Greece, we see this fundamental divide between Plato, who's a more rationalist, this focus on the reason or the intellect, and Aristotle, who's an empiricist, this focus on the senses and perception. So basically what Plato is saying is that the reason, the intellect, is really where knowledge comes from, whereas for Aristotle, this idea that knowledge actually comes from our senses. It comes from what we can perceive of the world around us. Okay, so the first meditation, this is where we see this early development of skepticism. I mean, Descartes begins by doubting, right? Doubting that he's sitting there, doubting that he is who he thinks he is, doubting that anything that he perceives with his senses could be proven. So he's searching for something that's absolutely true. And here we also get this idea of a malignant demon, this idea that something or someone might actually be tricking us. So a few discussion questions for you all. First, according to Descartes, why is it we cannot trust our senses? I have a passage here. But it may be, Descartes writes, that although the senses sometimes deceive us concerning things which are hardly perceptible or very far away, there are yet many others to be met with as to which we cannot reasonably have any doubt, although we recognize them by their means. For example, there is the fact that I am here, seated by the fire, attired in a dressing gown, having this paper in my hands and other similar matters. And how can I deny that these hands and this body are mine? Were it not perhaps that I compare myself to certain persons, devoid of sense, whose cerebella are so troubled and clouded by the violent vapors of black bile, that they constantly assure us that they are kings when they are really quite poor, and that they are clothed in purple when they are really without covering. And so basically one of the things that Descartes is saying here is that how can we trust our senses when our senses are able to deceive us? How can we trust our senses when we don't know if what we perceive, that what we think our senses are telling us is real, right? So, I mean, I think that I'm here in my living room, speaking at my computer, recording this lecture. How do I know that that's real? How do I know that this isn't a dream, for instance? How do I know that I'm not actually insane and just imagining this whole situation to be taking place? How do I know that I'm not some other being in some other place, some other planet, some other existence that's just having this as a dream, as a thought, as a passing fancy, right? So if our senses deceive us, how can we know that anything actually is true? So number 2, why does Descartes mention dreams? How does it inform his overall claims? Again, this gets this idea that this perception of reality can be tricked, right? We don't actually know. And so if we're dreaming, how do we know that we're dreaming? We've all had dreams where it feels real, where it feels like we're really there. How do we know that this isn't actually some kind of a dream as well? So again, it just leads to this systematic doubt of one's senses as a source of authority for reality, for knowledge. Okay, so how do Descartes' ideas exemplify skepticism? Here, basically, he's skeptical of all received knowledge. He's skeptical of the knowledge that he receives from other people, and he's even skeptical of the knowledge that he receives from his senses as well. So in the same way that he doesn't trust an authority like the church or the king to tell him what's real, what's not real, what he should do, he also doesn't trust his own senses to tell him that he is, in fact, sitting in his armchair at home, for instance. Okay. So, second meditation. Here we see Descartes searching for this fixed point, something he knows to be true. We get this idea that we cannot know for sure the things that we think that we know, right? This, again, going back to this idea of radical skepticism. We can be sure, however, that we think about things. And so ultimately for Descartes, this is the definition he comes up with for humanity, this idea that we are at root a thinking thing. We are a thing that thinks, right? We don't know that we're here. We don't know that we exist, but we do know that somewhere, sometime there is a subject, there is an I that is thinking, right? Okay, so first one here, how does Descartes come to the conclusion that he exists and he is a thinking thing? I have the passage here. He writes, I exist, that is certain, but how often? Just when I think, for it might possibly be the case if I ceased entirely to think, that I should likewise cease altogether to exist. I do not now admit anything which is not necessarily true. To speak accurately, I am no more than a thing which thinks. That is to say, a mind or soul or an understanding or a reason, which are terms whose significance was formerly unknown to me. I am, however, a real thing and really exists, but what thing? I've answered, a thing which thinks. What is a thing which thinks? It is a thing which doubts, understands, conceives, affirms, denies, wills, refuses, and also imagines and feels. So at heart, what we know, we don't know that the world is real. We don't know that we are really here. I don't know that I am who I think I am. But at heart, I do know that I am a being thinks. So to go back to the example I gave a moment ago, if I am some kind of alien having a dream about being a professor in Nevada in the United States, at heart, I still am a thing that's thinking, that's having that dream. There is ultimately some subjectivity. There is ultimately some I that exists to be having these thoughts. Okay. Number 2, explain Descartes' example of the wax. And so here he's going to this idea of perception and the way that our senses can trick us again. If you feel wax when it's a candle, for instance, it'll feel one way, it'll smell one way. Once it melts, it's going to feel a different way. It's going to smell a different way. So the actual attributes that our senses tell us, hard, soft, warm, cold, whatever, all these things might change, but it doesn't change the actual nature of the wax. And so in the same way that the wax can trick us into thinking that its actual substance is something else, we can be tricked by our perceptions, by our senses into thinking the things that we see, hear, touch, and so on are other than they really are. Okay. And this is something that we've all seen, right? We all have examples of hearing something and thinking it's something else, or seeing or having our eyes play tricks on us. Our senses can be tricked, right? And so this is something that we have to deal with if we use them as the basis, the fundamental building block of reality. Okay, number 3. Why does Descartes doubt the existence of the men that he can see from his window? What does he say they might be? I love this. Basically he doesn't know, right? So he looks out, he sees them. They might be real people. They look like people. They also might be automatons, right? They might be robots who are dressed up as people. He gives the example they might be automatons wearing trench coats, So basically, robots pretending to be people, which I just kind of love. But ultimately, how do we know? How do we know that we are who we are? How do we know that the people we interact with are who they say they are? Right? I think of something like The Truman Show as well, where everyone he's interacting with is actually an actor just playing a role. You can also think of things like The Matrix, where our senses are being tricked by what we see as well. And this is a fundamental worry, right? If our senses don't give us a true depiction of reality, how do we know that reality is the way that we think it is? So I will leave you with that thought. So basically, how do any of us know that we are who we think we are? How do we know that we are, in your case, people who are listening to this lecture, watching this lecture online? And how do you know that people around you really are who they say they are, right? So if we start doubting, if we start this systematic radical skepticism, if we start being skeptical in this way, all of a sudden a lot of things that we take as absolutely true and absolutely foundational become a lot more questionable. So I will leave you all with that, I believe. So to recap, we talked about Descartes, we talked about his meditations on first philosophy, we talked about this concept of radical skepticism, and we also looked at Descartes, this Cartesian, this is an adjective just describing something from Descartes, this Cartesian approach, this rational approach to understanding. All right, folks, that's it. For next time, do make sure you read Hobbes, Leviathan. You have selections there, also from John Locke. Selections, and then also this very short essay by Immanuel Kant, which I love, which is just what is enlightenment. All right, folks, that's it. I hope you enjoyed, and I look forward to talking about this all with you all at some point, or for you all talking about it in your discussion sections. All right, folks, take care.